Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Dante's Inferno. Now, Dante's Inferno is a 1911 silent Italian horror fantasy film, and apparently this was Italy's first feature-length film. Now, when this movie came out, film was very much in its infancy, and movies back during this time period were typically only 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes long, but this was Italy's first, what we would today call, feature-length film, even though the movie itself is only a little over an hour long. It's funny, I've heard a lot of people call D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation the first feature-length film, and that might be the first feature-length American film, but this predates Birth of a Nation by a good 4 years, and it's way less racist. Now, this movie is based on the epic poem The Inferno by famous Italian poet Dante Alighieri. Now, The Inferno was actually part 1 of the Divine Comedy, which was a 3-part poem written in the 14th century about Dante going through the 3 realms of the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and then heaven. Now, this movie only adapts the first part of the Divine Comedy. It completely ignores the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. Now, I have read the Divine Comedy, and I think it's a beautiful piece of literature. Actually, it's one of my top 10 favorite books of all time, but I'll be lying if I said The Inferno wasn't my favorite part of the Divine Comedy. Now, this, as far as I know, is the first actual film adaptation of The Inferno, but there have been several different adaptations of The Inferno over the years, but most of them only loosely adapt the story, or completely do their own thing with it, or they try to modernize it, like the 1925 film Macus in Hell, which I reviewed a few years ago. That's considered to be a very loose adaptation of Dante's Inferno. Of course, you had that dumbass video game from like 10 years ago, and actually the recent Lars von Trier film, The House That Jack Built, the last act of that movie is also kind of a loose adaptation of Dante's Inferno. Virgil is actually a speaking character in that movie. Now, descriptions of this movie online say that this is loosely adapted from Dante's Inferno, but to be honest, this is actually a pretty straightforward adaptation of the story. Now, the plot of Dante's Inferno is it begins where the poet Dante is lost in this dark wood. So Beatrice, a woman who Dante knew, who died when she was very young, she descends from heaven and asks the spirit of the poet Virgil, who is a huge influence on Dante, to guide him to heaven, but in order to get to heaven, he needs to go through hell and then purgatory. So, throughout the film, Dante and Virgil travel through the 9 circles of hell. Depending on how evil your sin was, the deeper in hell you go, until they ultimately get to the 9th circle of hell, where traitors have to spend eternity frozen in a lake of ice. The 9th circle is also where the angel Lucifer has been condemned for his rebellion against God. And the devil has 3 mouths. In one of them, he chews on the head of Judas Iscariot, the biblical betrayer of Christ. In his other 2 mouths, he chews on the heads of Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. You know, it's funny, the Bible doesn't say anything about Judas having to spend eternity giving Satan head. But Dante's Inferno is a really interesting film. I can't say you necessarily get the same emotion out of it that you might from the poem, but if you are a fan of the poem and you want to see a relatively straightforward adaptation of the poem, then definitely check this out. It's also a really interesting piece of film history. If you want to see an early example of the horror film or the fantasy film, definitely check this out. Sure, some of the effects in the film are kinda cheesy, like in the scene where you see Beatrice, behind her is what's supposed to be like a halo or the light of God, and it's so clearly a fan going behind her head. And then there's a scene where you see Cerberus, the 3-headed dog from Greek mythology, and it's so clearly a puppet. So there's a lot of effects work in this film that is very cheesy, but the film came out well over 100 years ago, so if you're gonna bitch that much about effects from a movie that's over 100 years old, then you're kind of a douchebag. But that being said, there's actually some effects work in the movie that, while it's certainly dated by today's standards, is still actually really cool looking. Like, there's a scene where a sinner is turned into this, like, reptile-like creature, and they use, like, stop motion and claymation, and again, it's dated, but it's still pretty cool looking. Some of the makeup effects for the demons is actually pretty cool, and there is actually one scene in the movie that I can imagine was probably pretty shocking for the time, because it's actually really violent and gory. There's a scene where Dante and Virgil look upon these sinners who are being absolutely mutilated by the demons, and you see them carrying around their severed limbs, and you see this one guy carrying around his severed head. And those effects, while you can certainly tell how they were done, were still probably pretty impressive for the time. There are also some scenes in the movie where the sinners tell Dante their stories of how they ended up in hell, and those sequences are really well done. And they are taken directly from the book. But yeah, I recommend Dante's Inferno, mainly if you're a fan of silent films. If you're not, then obviously this is not going to be for you. Now, I can't say this is the first feature-length film, but this might very well be the oldest surviving one, and as somebody who's interested in film history, that's pretty cool to me. So, that was my review on the 1911 version of Dante's Inferno, and bye.